introduce her in just a couple of minutes. But I want to say, I want to welcome you, thank you so much for being here tonight. I think the turnout tonight is an indication that it is a good time to establish a chapter of the Bird Society in this area and make it another hub of bird activity, bird watching, field trips, monthly meetings, and conservation activities on behalf of birds in southwest Nova Scotia. So, I just a couple of other things I want to mention before we start is that there's membership forms available in the back of the room, and the membership is $20 if you'd like to become a member. We're going to try to have monthly meetings, and the meetings will be, right now we're looking at the fourth Tuesday of every month. So we'll see if there's enough interest to go for every month. If not, we'll do it a bit more sporadically, but we'll aim for a monthly meeting at this time. The next meeting in October will be on roseate terms. Alex, would you like to say a little bit what you hope will be taking place at that meeting?
I got an email from Sean, who's actually right behind here.
Oh, hi, Sean.
Yeah, Sean Craig from University of Saint. So we'll probably do a bit of a brief history of the roseate terns in Lobster Bay. But the bulk of the presentation will be by Nick Knudsen, and here's a bit of a blurb about his talk. Less than 70 pairs of endangered roseate terns currently breed in Canada, and the majority of these birds nest in southwest Nova Scotia. Nick Knudsen's Master of Science research focuses on decisions made by roseate terns for selecting habitat at the colony and nest site levels. Nick's fieldwork has been based at the newly established tern colony on Gull Island in Lobster Bay. His thesis will help guide conservation biologists in identifying potentially suitable nesting habitat for roseate terns elsewhere in Nova Scotia. And Nick is undertaking his Master in Science at Acadian University and is co-supervised by Professors Mark Mallory of Acadia and Sean Craig of University of Saint John.
Great. Thank you. Sounds good. So we look forward to that next month. Just one more thing. There's some different Bird Society paraphernalia in the back if you're interested. I only have one price list, so you'll have to ask me what the price of them is. Yes.
Who are you?
I'm John Carney. So I'm not introducing myself. Yes.
John, if you're already a Bird Society member, are you automatically a member of the chapter?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And as far as I'm concerned, everyone is welcome to come to these meetings.
And that membership can be paid online, can it?
Yes. And the membership will be changing on January 1st, but if you buy an individual membership now for $20, it'll be the same
There's incentive.
in January. You're safe at $20. It won't be going up on the individual membership. Actually, prices are going to be less, I think, overall. So, with that said, it's my great honor to introduce Donna Crossland. Those of you who followed the debate on forest policy in Nova Scotia will know the name of Donna Crossland. She is one of the leading voices for ecology-based sustainable forestry in the province, and she is a strong advocate for restoring forest biodiversity, its natural structure, and ecosystem processes. Donna grew up in the forests of East Dalhousie, Kings County, and presently resides on and owns a small woodlot in Tupperville, Annapolis County. She works at Kejimkujik National Park and National Historic Site as a resource management officer. This work entails conducting forest songbird surveys, loon monitoring, vegetation management, with a focus on managing a beach restoration seed orchard and managing invasive species such as glossy buckthorn and the dreaded hemlock woolly belcher. She is also a member of Keji's emergency response team for fire and public safety emergencies. Donna's early years were spent working as a National Park Warden in PEI, Kejimkujik, and Kejimkujik. She obtained a master's degree in forestry in 2007, and from 2009 to 2010, she served on the Nova Scotia Forest Panel of Expertise and co-authored the report with Bob Bancroft, Forests, Restoring the Health of Nova Scotia Forests. She is currently an executive member of the Medway Community Forest Co-op and Vice President of Nature Nova Scotia. It is a great pleasure to have you speak to us today, Donna.
Well, thank you, John. I must say I'm a little disappointed. I thought if this was the first meeting, there'd be some kind of induction screeching in or something that happens to birders that turn out for the new chapter. I'm pretty sure motorcycle chapters, there's some kind of ritual, but just saying it's, oh well. Well, it really is an honor and a pleasure to be here with you tonight with so many knowledgeable people and with your own talents, especially when it comes to the bird world and the habitat that birds need to breed and produce progeny for future generations. So I must come out now and say that I don't feel that I am a birder, so you will exceed me in what you know about birds, but I do the forest songbird counts, and I'm one of those people that spends all year waiting for May and June to come around, and so that I can get back out into the woods. So yeah, I'm not a bird expert, and I'm not speaking on behalf of Parks Canada because that would require a whole other level of questioning and red tape. So I'm really here as a concerned citizen, just like many of you are, to speak about some of the forest mismanagement and what that implies for bird habitat requirements. And of course, secretly, I'm hoping, my real objective is I'm hoping that some of you will aid in protecting bird habitats. Many of you probably are already doing that, but certainly I've got some ideas of things that we may want to think about as we move forward in this period of trying to get lands and forestry, aka DNR, to do better management of our forests, because we can't glue those trees back on the stumps. So now's the time to make a stand for the remaining forests in southwest Nova Scotia in particular. As I go along, do interrupt. I like interruptions because there may be something that isn't clear. So by all means, speak out if you've got something to add. So our anthropogenic effects on birds are an overriding signal now on planet Earth, and it's amazing. It's surprising that birds are still able to navigate sometimes when you think of how much humans have modified the natural world that they need in order to survive and to migrate and to just get around. This isn't advancing. I'm wondering, hopefully the batteries are okay in it. If we take the Canada warbler, for instance, a species at risk, it migrates from South America to Nova Scotia and other parts of North America. It's just a map that I stole off the net, but just to get us thinking about how these birds have to navigate to Nova Scotia, our forests, which are its breeding habitat. And we know that the decline from the Canada warbler has been in decline, largely due to deforestation in the tropics. But before we get too angry, it's about rainforest destruction, which is, of course, of great concern. Okay, we're not going to get along here. We should look perhaps at what we're doing in Nova Scotia in terms of adding another stressor to an already stressed species. We know that most of, I think it might be a low battery in this. I can't use the pointer neither, it looks like. Anyway, I think I've got another pointer. Well,
Are they AAA or AA?
I'm not just sure how to break it apart. I'll pass it over to you, and I can just use the computer. Yeah. Anyway, so just to say you're actually moving things along quite nicely.
I could bring a 6-year-old.
So we're harvesting the wooded swamps where the Canada warbler, of course, prefers to breed. And this is a map of forest cover loss. When you go to the University of Maryland site, there's some interesting maps you can download, take screenshots of. And all the red areas on the map are is the forest loss between the years 2000 and 2017. And you can see Nova Scotia looks fairly red in that picture, but so we have a number of neotropical migrant species that come to our forests, nowhere else to breed in a very short time period, species like the Blackburnian and bay-breasted warblers, and some of them require actually mature forest habitat and old growth. A lot of them require a certain forest structure, as we know, so canopy closure, large trees. So forests basically, when we, how are we going?
Oh, so these are okay?
Well, those were the batteries in there.
Oh.
We thought
Okay.
you had some there.
Okay, let's see, how do we get them out?
Sometimes if you turn them, they...
Yeah, maybe it's, I can just use this and I think I have another, pointer somewhere, right next to my compass.
I should have noticed before I took notes.
Or not. It's lit up.
Please.
Here, we'll try it. Oh, that seems to work better, yeah. This is just an example of, now I see that we've got all kinds of problems here, of trends in certain forest birds. We monitor birds in hemlock stands and mixedwood stands in Kejimkujik over the past number of years and are trying to follow trends in certain birds. And of course, we know it's directly related to how the forests are doing. Birds do well when if they're forest-dwelling birds, they do well if your forests are remaining intact. I know some of you now are being really keen and looking and saying, which species is that? But oh yes, we even have, so bay-breasted warbler is the blue line, and I didn't add 2018 data yet, but we have seen an increase, a slight increase in the bay-breasted warbler, and probably because of the budworm outbreaks that are happening elsewhere. So maybe the declining trend will come back. But Eastern wood pewee, just another example, just because mostly I had a photo of Eastern wood pewee nest. We know that the cause of the decline is not quite clear, but loss of habitat in the wintering range is part of it, but also forest practices in Canada is a big cause. And of course, we're harvesting right in the nesting period of a lot of these birds, and there's no way you can even find these nests unless you're really keen, like Alex and some of the other people in the room, and can actually, finding nests is very difficult to do, as we know. So when it just looks like a little knot on a tree branch, for instance. So here's a map of forest loss from the years 2000 to 2017, the red being all the forest cover loss that the satellites detected. And so, for a decade and a half, that's a lot of forest loss. That's an unsustainable amount of forest loss. When we look at the area,
You just move.
yeah, I was good. No, I don't, oh, well, okay, yeah, that's
Smaller.
better. And it's still in focus, I guess. When we look at our area in Yarmouth, it's doing a little bit better than elsewhere. But we'll see what the future holds for you. Now we have Forest Nova Scotia, the voice of industry, the forest industry, saying that they're assuring us all the time with advertisements and that they're taking good care of our forests. In fact, they had one slogan, no one loves forests, no one loves our forests more than we do, and I keep looking at that and going, that's just way too much love. And then we have our former Minister of Natural Resources a year ago last spring saying there is no evidence that deforestation is a consequence of forest management. And I'm going,
Why not?
So if deforestation isn't a consequence of forest management, this is probably just expansion of moose land is quite an active spot if you've ever been there, or Bridgetown over here may be expanding. It's probably urban sprawl, perhaps. But and what was alarming, or what has been alarming, is that the voice of industry sounds a lot like our politicians, our Minister of Natural Resources, and so I've been pointing that out to our Premier because he happens to be my MLA, and pointing it out in the Leahy independent review as well, that this is not acceptable. As we know, clear cutting and over-harvesting have worsened in the last decade and a half, and so critical thresholds have been surpassed. The Leahy Independent Forest Review it came into being because of some of us repeatedly saying this is not acceptable. And so he was asked to revise approaches to forest management. And have many of you read his report yet? Not just to...
I'm supposed to.
Yes.
It's supposed to, yes, that's your homework, John. So it is online, it is available, and it's certainly the recommendations are a fairly small report, but then there are research addenda which Dr. Leahy has suggested that you read the research addenda first, which I actually haven't had time to get through yet myself, but what he got from his forest experts are all in the addenda, and then he came up with these recommendations. And he did specifically mention birds, bird habitat, when he released his report. So there is hope, but we've had a significant amount of forest loss. He made a lot of recommendations for crown land, probably because of two presentations from me saying if we can't get crown land right, how are we ever going to manage private land? And so it seemed that every recommendation I gave him ended up being in there, which is good. But now I wish I'd have made a whole lot more recommendations for crown land, for private land as well, because private land is the largest portion of our land base. So the light green color here is the crown land in southwest Nova Scotia. Here's Kejimkujik National Park. And so it is good for you to pay attention to what Leahy has recommended, because it's going to affect this land base near where you're living. And one of the things he's recommended, and probably, well, according to DNR, they've already adopted this approach, is using the triad approach to forest management on crown land. So it doesn't mean exactly that it's going to be 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3 of the land divided up into these three treatments, but the idea is that you'll have some of the land in protected areas, some of the land will be in plantations, which is concerning, but some of the land is already in plantation form on our crown land. And then the largest leg on the three-legged stool is supposed to be ecologically based or ecosystem based forestry. So now you have to ask, what is ecosystem based forestry or ecological forestry? And so I'm hoping that you'll take away some fresh ideas in your mind as to what that is, and make sure that that is what we advocate that government implements, because these are merely recommendations at this point. And so we're a long way from taking this report and making it so. And there's some things open to interpretation. So Dr. Leahy referred a lot to the spirit and intent of his recommendations, and I'm going, spirit and intent is too much wiggle room for an industry that's very good at spinning the truth and reality. So here's your forest cover loss for this area, and it's not so bad, but it does show still the red areas are all the areas that have been clear cut or enough forest removed that it shows up on satellite imagery. But I'd want to draw your attention to this little lake here. Maybe some of you know it, Wagner Lake. And there's a big clear cut beside Wagner Lake. Somebody from there?
I saw many huge pines go by my house.
Okay, well, I'm concerned about Wagner Lake now, because if we keep I'm going to zoom in on Wagner Lake. Here's Wagner Lake, and here's that clear cut that was in red in the back. And so there's these proposed clear cuts on either side. The yellower colors are partial cuts, but partial cuts are nearly always two-stage clear cuts. They just go in and take out roughly half the timber, and then once they think there's enough regen on the forest floor, then they come back and take the rest. So if you're a flying squirrel, I always say if you're a flying squirrel, you're still screwed, because because there goes all of your food source and your forest cover in terms of habitat. So if you haven't signed up for the notifications on Harvest Plans Map Viewer yet, you can do that. You just go onto the DNR website, the government website, and you can sign up to get email notifications for Harvest Plans Map Viewer. Darn it, I just remembered I had brought note paper with me and pens, and I was going to go back to, they're in a little bag in the trunk. That's my husband that just, without asking, he did that. But at home, no, does that work at home? That does not work at home, I just want to say. It's just on really good behavior in front of all of you. I don't want to be too pushy, but there may be some ideas here that you want to write down, and so I had brought some paper and some extra pens just in case, because this is something you should do, because then what you can do is then go on the pre-treatment assessment, but you push that little button and you can get the information of each one of these cut blocks, as they like to call them, or polygons, and they'll email you, and then you can write back and say that you're very concerned about this kind of harvest and why you're concerned. And so I have some ideas then as to what you can say after that, why you're concerned. But the Acadian mixedwood forest, as we know, is a blend of trees found nowhere else on Earth. And it's a combination of a whole number of species. It's a very diverse number of species. Some of them are temperate, meaning that they have forest tree distributions that extend further south into the New England states. And we have also boreal species that have ranges that extend further to the north. And so our temperate species, it's these temperate species that make the Acadian forest special, but it also makes it a critically endangered ecosystem. The World Wildlife Fund in the late 1990s declared it a critically endangered ecosystem, but we're not treating it like one. And it was mostly due to the decline of the species that I've just circled there in red, the red spruce, hemlock, sugar maple, yellow birch, and beech. And we know that the beech has had a precipitous decline because of the beech canker introduction into Halifax Harbor in, I think, roughly the 1930s, but we're also now being affected by hemlock woolly adelgid on the hemlock. And many of these species were very sensitive to fire, and so they decreased from either wildfires or logging or both. The Acadian forest has been very, very much affected since European settlement. There's another way to divide these species, and that's into the shade intolerant group, meaning those are the ones that don't like to be in the shade, they like to be in full sun. white spruce, white birch, aspens, larch is one. White pine is sort of in between, but it sometimes it's a little bit shade tolerant, but it likes at least 50% sunlight to get established on the forest floor. And many of these species are shorter lived, except for the ones I have in parentheses like red oak and white pine that can live a very long time. And we can also consider them the early successional species. So if you do a clear cut, they're the ones that like to grow in the open sunlight, and they'll come in the open clear cut. Whereas if you've got shade tolerant species, those are the species tolerant of shade. In other words, they don't really need full sunlight. In fact, they don't really like full sunlight for growth conditions. So, and they tend to be our longer lived and late successional species. So red spruce, eastern hemlock, sugar maple, those are the ones that tend to be higher quality trees. And they like some shade, and especially if you're in a saw log economy, you need that side shade at least so that trees grow tall and straight. We used to be in a saw log economy, and you still have sawmills down here. So, you know, this is what you need. You need some shade in order to grow these higher quality species and longer lived species. So it's another way, and foresters use these terms all the time. So. I see Larry shaking his head, so he obviously didn't find a little bag of, I think it was in the back seat. Okay. Well, you'll have to memorize then, or find some paper here to scribble on. Back of a napkin. So shade intolerant again. Forests look like this white birch forest, which got clear cut on Crown land a couple of years ago, and was the stand that made me so angry I ended up writing about, I forget what it was called, chipping songbird nests for, I had a nest of a Parula warbler nest, and I was chipping forests for songbirds or something. It was in the Chronicle Herald, but because I heard Parulas singing in there, and I knew there were territorial males and a number of other species. It was just at the end of June, and they were mowing this down in clear cut, and I was like, for what? Like, those are not saw logs. Those can't go for anything except wood chips, and those are our public lands being mowed down. And so it made me so angry. I spent the July 1st weekend writing a letter to the Herald, which got printed, and hopefully made them squirm a little bit. So the key to Acadian forest biodiversity and resiliency is really about sunlight, though. It's about managing how much sunlight gets to the forest floor, and not having too much in a clear-cut situation. So managing for shade on the forest floor. If there's one thing you're looking at doing right, if you're looking for ways you sustainably manage forests or your woodlot, it doesn't have to be that complicated. Patch size matters. Various size patches will get you to managing for biodiversity in your woodlot. And I always give it the yellow-spotted salamander test, that if you think about the yellow-spotted salamander and it's going across a hot, dry, clear cut, it's not going to make, it's going to desiccate, it's going to dry out. So if you can have healthy salamander populations in your forest, then you're probably doing okay. Well, I'm going to go through just a couple of fairly technical things here, just because I think it's important, because if you live down here, this is very relevant to you and your forest situation. This is a map of forest sensitivity that the acid rain scientists generated a number of years ago, and basically the green areas are the areas that are less sensitive to acid rain, and as soon as you go down on the color spectrum here to the orange and reddish areas, those are the areas most sensitive to acid rain. And so it's also the area where we have the highest soil nutrient losses, calcium, nitrogen, etc. And they're the areas where there's more nutrients leaving the soil than what's being put into the soil. Well, why would that be? Why is it so nutrient deficient down here? Well, where are you going to get soil nutrients from? Where would they come from?
Bedrock.
The bedrock, right? You were at the yeah, he remembers this. The bedrock. So we've got very hard bedrock down here, right? It's mostly granite rock. and basalt. Is it basalt down here?
Up towards the valley side.
I was going to say, I picture that more on the North Mountain basalt, but yeah, anyway, rock that doesn't weather very much. But if you go to where I used to live in eastern New Brunswick, it's green there because if you've ever been to PEI in eastern New Brunswick, what kind of rock do they have? Sandstone, yeah. You can almost crush it in your hand, right? So it weathers very nicely, and so it gives up its nutrients. So the calcium and other elements are given from the bedrock. And the only other place you're going to get these nutrients from is from the rain. So there's only two places you can get nutrients from, rain or bedrock. Well, you're screwed down here because your bedrock is so hard. I know because I grew up in here, and we also have the South Mountain batholith, and it's very tough on, it's a wonder we grew teeth, really. So that was a warm-up to this slide that I usually ask people to memorize. But I won't tonight, but it's tying it all together, because forests are tied to aquatic systems, they're tied to healthy brook trout populations and so on. So if we start over here in the top right, here is a map of Atlantic salmon runs, and the acid rain people were monitoring the streams after acid rain, and we know that acid rain has been reduced in the last 30 years, so now it's roughly half of what it once was. And so a lot of these streams recovered, and now they have, once again, healthy trout and salmon populations, are relatively healthy, but the black dots are extinct runs of salmon, and the red dots are remnant populations of salmon. And so all the black dots, if you notice, are down here. There's no black dots or red dots up here. These are much healthier streams, and if you look at the connection, this is where the soil nutrients are. So this has much better stream buffering capacity, more calcium in the streams, so it gives the pH of those streams isn't as low, or it's not as acidic as these streams down here. So we just don't have a lot of buffering capacity in the southwest. So the foresters are out there. You're probably wondering, where is she going with the forest? So if you're a forester, what Dr. Patrickin has taught me, he was a professor at Dalhousie, is that if you're wondering if you should clear cut the hardwood drumlin, it's like taking a blood test to see, a diagnostic blood test to see how you're doing health-wise. Well, there's a stream at the bottom of the drumlin. Think of it as your blood test. You go down to the bottom of the drumlin, you test the pH of the stream. If the pH is already on the brink of being quite acidic, because trout, I think, it blinks out at just below pH 4.5, I think.
4.7, I think.
4.7? 4.5 is where they kind of blink out. Yeah, I thought it was somewhere around there. So if your pH is already quite low, you don't want to cut the hardwood drumlin, because that's the only chance, that's the only buffering capacity for that stream. That if you cut the hardwood drumlin, you could very well cause the stream to acidify, and your last remnant populations of salmon or brook trout, if it blink out. So there is a connection, and this is the premier liked this example and was wondering if his foresters talk to his aquatic people or not, and we were thinking probably not, but he was going to organize a meeting between the foresters and the aquatic specialists, but I don't think that's ever taken place. But basically your hardwoods are deep-rooted trees, and they can reach down into the soil and bring the nutrients back up to the surface, like calcium, and then there is a buffering capacity then for the streams. And so we just don't want to do any more clear cutting in the southwest if you care about fish populations. But unfortunately, about 60% of soils in Nova Scotia are nutrient depleted, in particular down this way. And so we conclude that partial harvest, you can go in and you can do partial harvest, but you just can't clear cut these soils down this way, because they just won't take the pressure you will leach out the nutrients, and you'll also jeopardize your salmonid populations, your trout and your salmon. And I'm a little annoyed because DNR has been working on a nutrient budget model for ages, for over 10 years. We just never see it. And it was supposed to look at which soils in Nova Scotia have enough nutrients to allow clear cutting to continue. And of course, we haven't seen the results, and I'm suspicious that the reason why they haven't showed us is that clearly it would show that all of southwest Nova Scotia is unable to support clear cutting because it just doesn't have it would send us into a nutrient deficit mode and leave the next generation of trees and people even poorer than we are now. I also want to get just another little technical side note here, carbon sequestration, which is part of the answer to forestry on woodlots. If we just be able to get the politicians moving on this. We know that trees do a marvelous thing, all plants do this wonderful thing. They can take carbon dioxide molecules and split off the carbon atom and put the carbon into the tree. The carbon is incorporated into the woody material and the needles and leaves, and off goes the oxygen into the atmosphere. And we find that handy because we breathe in oxygen. But in the meantime, the carbon is incorporated into the roots of the tree, and so a lot of the carbon ends up being incorporated into the soil as well. Any dead wood decomposes, and again the carbon gets incorporated into the soil column. And so we all know about this chocolate brown soil that's the best for growing our vegetables in, and if you want to look for rich soils, you're looking for the dark humus layer. And so that is produced by forests. Forests are what make soil, and farmers don't necessarily put that together, but without forests we wouldn't have soil for agriculture. So if we think of, since the glaciers left us, slowly over time pioneer species come into a system, and eventually they're incorporating that carbon from the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the soil, into the plant tissue, and eventually into the soil. And over time, this is a bit of an exaggerated diagram, but over time the carbon builds up and becomes this nice, deep, rich humus layer or organic layer. And in climax forest communities is where most of it can really be significant accumulations of carbon. Well, the other neat thing about carbon dioxide, if we look at this thin blue line here, and here starting at about 1750, the carbon dioxide levels in our atmosphere started to increase. And they really took off after about 1850. They started to go really high, and then they just skyrocketed here. And so why is carbon dioxide skyrocketing?
Coal-fired.
Coal gas, yeah. So the combustion of fossil fuels. But what we've heard about the combustion of fossil fuels, but it turns out that a lot of that carbon dioxide is also from forest cover loss, the loss of our forests. And that's why it starts way back here. In the 1850s, there was a lot of agriculture happening in North America. We were setting forests on fire everywhere, trying to make gardens and grow food. And carbon, we need to keep it in our forests and soil instead of it as greenhouse gases. We're not fond of climate change, but here we are with our carbon leaving our soils and ending up in greenhouse gas. In fact, about 60% of the carbon in our forest is not in the tree tissue above ground, it's below ground. And so we actually have people like Dale Prest, who you may have heard of, who's studied soil carbon, and he's actually, as part of his research, measured these shrinking soils, that after a clear cut, the soils actually shrink because of this layer. What happens is the sun comes in, speeds up the decay rate here, and so a lot of the organics then are released as carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere. So you'll actually see that humus layer shrink. So requesting carbon offset opportunities with outside markets, the polluters outside Nova, because we don't have a lot of polluters in Nova Scotia. So if you want to offset someone that's making a lot of carbon dioxide by saying, well, I'll keep my woodlot intact, and I'll keep 60% of my carbon here and 25% there. I'll offset your polluting in southern Ontario or your polluting in California. There's good money to be made from that, and Dale Prest is one of those people that's making some very good cash annually on a farm that he's bought in New Brunswick. But at any rate, we're not quite ready to do that in Nova Scotia, but we need to continue to push for that because there's not a lot in the Leahy report on carbon, and it really is part of the silver bullet for the future. So clear cutting reduces the soil carbon and increases greenhouse gases. That's not good. And forestry practices ignore the modern carbon science. So they've been saying all along that they're really science-based, and yet carbon science is like, it's not discussed. So basically you've got a clear cut, and when you think of it, the sun comes out, warms up the humus layer, and the decomposition rate speeds up, and when that happens, out goes the carbon dioxide. So up goes your organic layer into the atmosphere. And then down comes the rain, and doesn't wash the spider out, but well, maybe wash the spiders out, but it also then leaches out your calcium and your nitrogen and other nutrients. So this is a very, very bad scenario where you're making yourself even more nutrient poor, and you're losing your organic layer as well. And that's our legacy for the future generation. So if I sound a little bit jaded, it's because I've been looking at these satellite images of forest cover loss. This is from Global Forest Watch. The blue areas and brown areas are protected areas. But the pink signifies the amount of cover loss in the year 2000, forest cover loss. So that's the human signal. And then in 2017, that's how much forest cover loss has taken place cumulatively. And so that's just not sustainable. It's, you know, it should be mostly green. And I asked the Premier, I actually showed images like this to Premier McNeil and said, where do we go from here? Like if you live there, what is the industry that you can't live off the land if you've removed all the forest that closely? I don't even know if they have any wildlife left in that area other than white-tailed deer that can survive that kind of disturbance regime. And so your economic possibilities are reduced. And yet we have, you know, the Minister of Natural Resources now, Margaret Miller has moved on to be the Minister of Environment, which probably doesn't make you feel any better. But she said last April, there has been a substantial increase in forest overall, primarily as a result of farm abandonment and fire suppression. It doesn't make any sense, does it? A substantial increase in forest overall. We know that there's been farms, subsistence farms, that are no longer being farmed, and fields have grown up, but they're hardly, a lot of them aren't really forest. Not in an area like that. So she read her script very well, but it doesn't make any sense. So
could she be talking about the time frame?
I guess if you go back to 1800 when we had even more forests in farming, but it still doesn't make sense because we weren't clear cutting back then. So it's a nonsensical statement, and of course industry and people that were in industry that are now in government are writing these lines, and politicians are believing them because apparently they never fly over the province in a plane. Central Nova Scotia. Yeah, and it is hard actually to see when you're looking out a plane window. Everything can look green down there, but when you look at these satellite interpreted images, you start to really recognize the amount of loss.
There's trees down there, but they're a lot shorter.
Yeah, they're only this.
Yeah,
They're
you know, like probably fourth generation at the most.
Exactly. So I mean, here's an example in central Nova Scotia. And I call it Yeah, I just want to do that again. Like, that's a lot of forest cover loss, and that's why people were getting so angry. And that's I think the Gasbro that drains into the Minas Basin, just below the Minas Basin. So we're headed towards ecological collapse. There's definitely a loss of biodiversity, because this isn't just about loss of forest cover. This is also about all of the animals, the cascading effects, all the animals and plants, understory, ground flora that depend on forests.
You have another factor working, and that's the type of tree. Like you talked about the forest floor. Well, if the forest is mostly evergreen, then you have a lot of acidity in the soil. So it gets washed out, gets bleached out more. Whereas the natural forest for Nova Scotia would be definitely a mixed forest.
Most of it, yeah, it would be mixed,
So it would be,
deeper rooted.
And the deciduous trees are actually the ones that add the nutrients to the soil.
Exactly, yeah, it is mostly because the deciduous ones have the deepest roots, or they tend to be deeper rooted, so they're the ones that are going to...
They're the ones that the people around here, I think, want more of, because they want, a lot of people want to have, they want to burn wood. And you don't want, if you can help it, you don't want to put in your stove, you don't want to put softwood in your stove, you want hardwood in your stove. So they would prefer to have more of those hardwood trees around.
And the pulp and paper industry wanted the opposite, but of course now we've got pretty well the end of the pulp industry, but now we've got this indiscriminate cutting of biomass, so they don't even seem to care whether it's softwood or hardwood. They're just...
You even have less nutrients, because ordinarily that mass of branches and so on at least would go down and decompose in the soil.
Yeah.
Now they're removing that too.
Exactly. I'm getting to that. It's like you've been here before, because you're following this, which I'm glad.
I'm an old geography major, and I learned all this stuff in Ontario and in southern states, like one of my professors in university.
Well, and speaking of Ontario has actually, like, they get all this. It seems that Nova Scotia, we're dragging people into going, oh, right, we have to partially harvest. And I'm like, well, yeah, and they're doing this in Ontario, and the world didn't end, and they're doing better. They're doing tree marking and doing selection cuts, and yet in Nova Scotia we seem to have let the pulp and paper industry mislead us down this wrong path to forestry. So now we're in the southwest, but that's Cloud Lake protected area, so we're not quite down Yarmouth area yet. Annapolis Royal is just up and to the top left, and so not as much forest cover loss in the last 16, 17 years, but still quite a bit, and not sustainable. And this was an image that I had in the Chronicle Herald back a couple of years ago. And Marcus Zwicker, who is the manager of West 4, and that's if you don't know his name, it's good to know who he is, because West 4 manages the Crown lands down this way as well. He actually dissected my article in the paper, which was sharing my concerns about forest loss with this image, and said that I made a glaring omission because I did not put in the forest gain, which is also available on the Global Forest Watch website. And so, and the reason why I didn't is because I didn't want to confuse the image, because they're bright blue polygons in Global Forest Watch and you can't change them. But if we look at, say, this green patch over here, and you go, oh, well, at least that's still forested, right? There's still forest over there, and just the pink areas of the forest cover loss. But when you look, this is the area of forest cover gain. And so what it means is this area isn't forested. It's really just forests that were clear-cut before the year 2000, and now they're growing back, but they're not forests yet. They're just gaining back trees. So all in all, with the pink and the blue patches, that's the human signal on the landscape in that area of southwest Nova Scotia. So his accusation, him saying he wanted to make sure that Nova Scotians see the whole picture and not what Donna Crossland was disguising in the newspaper article, was just, and then he alluded that actually that some of those pink areas were probably parking lots. So,
just before you go on, because I've been in that area a lot, what what are the rules about how close you can get to a lake with a clear cut like that?
There is no rule.
I don't think there is, because there's the Wildlife Habitat and Watercourses Protection Regulations, but they protect watercourses, but they don't say anything about lakes. So I don't think there is a law on how close you can cut up. Now they're supposed to be using the Code of Forest Practice on Crown lands, and so they're still not supposed to cut up right to a lake shore, but it seems that...
I was just curious, because we had canoed back in the wilderness back there earlier this spring, and when we got, it's the bottom left, that point, it's all the blue and pink, yeah, right, just up from there, that area there. And I can tell you right now, there's like maybe a row of trees between what they slaughtered down and the shore.
Yeah, they've been doing some very aggressive forestry on the Crown, and these are mostly West 4, well, they're pretty well all West 4 cuts. Yeah, so it's been, I mean, and these are our public lands, so I really urge everybody in the room, you're a well-informed group anyway, that our public lands should be for more than just forest practices, right? They should be for our recreation, the canoeing that you're doing, for birding, and a whole host of other activities. And some people
maintaining our water resources.
Exactly, they're the headwaters for a lot of our, you know, for the valley bottom and elsewhere. So Southwest Nova Scotia is our last wood basket left, because Eastern Nova Scotia and Central Nova Scotia are pretty well cleaned out. And so what I was very concerned about this and went to see the Premier. It's not as bad here, because this is, again, you can see Cloud Lake here, but it's getting worse. And in 2016 they abandoned FSC, and I felt that it was in preparation for massive harvesting impacts that couldn't be justified ecologically, because if you can't justify it ecologically, you're going to lose your Forest Stewardship Council, your FSC certification. So they just stopped paying into that, and clear cutting was their predominant mode of harvest, and in a biosphere reserve, no less. I believe you're still in the biosphere reserve down here, right? Did you feel like you're in a biosphere reserve? Because
No.
I'm not feeling the reserve type of feeling, but you know, this is, and we have more species at risk than anywhere else in Nova Scotia, and yet I don't feel that this integrated resource management process, the IRM process that DNR is supposed to have in place to oversee making sure harvests take species at risk and other factors into account before they harvest, I'm feeling like that's just not working for us. And so I went with these concerns, and I was more concerned with the former minister Hines describing the whole Southwest as a fiber basket. And I'm going, I'm sorry, but I feel like we're more than just a fiber basket. And he was also mentioning biofuel, which is worrisome, because grinding up trees to make fuel is also not, it's nonsensical.
So you're talking about a fiber basket being a place where they can get pulp and paper.
That's all he saw, you know.
Like, the wood is so downgraded, there's no point in even worrying about getting lumber from it.
It seems that it's prevalent now in forestry circles that they just refer to woods as fiber. It's just a fiber basket. And so I asked the Premier, I just said, will you let it happen? Will we let it happen? The last crown forest scrapped. Because what's happened in eastern and central Nova Scotia is coming this way. And so everybody down this way needs to be ready for that. Another thing that I want you to be aware of is that, and it came out a lot in the Leahy report, because I kept hammering away at natural disturbance regimes, because it was part of what I had researched in my master's degree in forestry, is natural disturbance regimes. We know that forests are periodically interrupted by disturbance agents, natural agents of disturbance, meaning fire, natural fire from lightning, and from insect outbreaks, from wind events. And so this can create, so that not always is forest going to be in this mature old growth state. But so DNR wrote their own natural disturbance regime report, and the green bar is the green areas in the province are the areas that they feel are naturally very frequently disturbed. And so you are very frequently disturbed down here in southwest Nova Scotia, according to them. You're mostly in the green bar, and so the yellow is open seral stages, which is even more severe disturbance regime, meaning that it's sort of heathlands and areas where trees don't grow very well at all. And that the brown area, these areas, are the gap replacement areas of the province where trees just regenerate in small gaps naturally. So that's what they're asserting, and I've been railing at them for over 10 years, saying this report is so horribly, wretchedly flawed that it shouldn't be used at all. And I didn't get very far with it until last winter. But you know, if you followed that at all, the area under frequent disturbance, which is about 40%, that would mean that about 40% of, if you're going to follow Mother Nature, that means that that would be the areas that you would clear cut. And the infrequent disturbance areas would be the areas that you do selection harvest, and then gap replacement would be, wait a second, maybe, or partial harvest, I guess. The gap replacement would be, actually gap replacement should be selection harvest, and this should be partial harvest. But at any rate, it's all gobbledygook, really, because they've just, it wasn't based on science. And at any rate, they weren't following their very own estimates for what's frequent disturbance and what isn't. But I mean, how often do you feel that the forests down here are getting hit by lightning and caught on fire?
Hardly ever.
2006 was the last year I remember a fair number of forest fires around here.
Yeah, and most of those, I mean, 99.9% of fires in Nova Scotia are human caused. And so scientists outside DNR kept stating that this should be a gap replacement ecosystem. The Acadian forest isn't driven by fire, it's driven by wind disturbance and insect disturbance. And this is what was determined through research in the US and determined from my own research in eastern New Brunswick, Acadian forest, when I looked at the historical forest ecology. This report was never peer reviewed, it was widely critiqued, and no response ever came back from DNR. And I think Goldsmith says it best in 1979, saying, to ensure the continuance of a healthy forest, it is also necessary to ensure that the age class and the girth structure of the forest does not deteriorate. So he was concerned, obviously, with overharvesting and too much disturbance in Nova Scotia's forests. So the whole thing is a fallacy, and I call it the inconvenient truth, that does clear cutting actually really emulate a natural fire, a forest fire? Well, there's big differences between the two. I mean, with fire, you see that most of the coarse wood is left on the landscape. It doesn't actually burn up in a fire. Only the fine fuels, the fine branches and leaves and needles actually burn up, and the coarse wood is left behind. There is no natural disturbance agent that does that on the landscape. So the whole thing is pretty silly. So clear cutting doesn't really approximate fire. But it is important to know, like, so where did they get this from in the first place? Well, everywhere they went in Nova Scotia, they found charcoal in the soil, because charcoal will endure for thousands of years. If a fire goes through here, you're going to find the charcoal 1,000 years later in the soil. And so that's what they were finding was early fires from Nova Scotia. Well, what was happening? If we go back to 1882, Robert Lyons says it's a matter of record that forests of Nova Scotia had not been visited by any great fires until 1784. So very early on, in 1784. That year, no rain fell. Sound familiar for this year? Yeah. Fires were kindled in the clearings by the new settlers. Yeah. 2/3 of the province were burnt over. And we don't remember that. 2/3 of the province was burnt over. And in case you're thinking that this is not really made up, there were a lot of fires down this way, and so I'm sure when Peter Neely and Bruce Stewart and others from DNR came down to the landscape around here, they found lots of evidence of fire, because we have like Beaver River's Great Fire of 1820. Beaver River isn't far from here, right?
No.
And these people were out, they said in a few minutes they were in the breakers, but striking, they were out by boat anyway, and then they found the whole shore in flames eastward, landed near Porters, and followed the shore all around to Black Point, the wind blowing, a hurricane. The flames outran us, an immense fire behind Frank DeVoe's, which threatened destruction to everything. We reached the road behind this fire, got home safe, took tea, thinking ourselves safe, went to assist the French, who were moving. Young Frank's house in flames, and others not to be seen for the smoke. We stayed perhaps 20 minutes, returned, met one of the children crying, "Clark's house is on fire." We ran our best, met women and children flying before the tempest, the mill, barn, and house with 20 acres of land in a blaze, trees falling in all directions. I'm going to leave a couple copies of this here, but just the destruction here around Beaver River must have been incredible. And Danielle has lost all, a cow, 2 hogs, furniture, clothing. And the word at sunset was to escape for their lives. Danielle took up his child and bid his wife follow him, and my brother Rana. Others cried, "Which way shall we fly?" Answer, "To the lake." Some reached it, others were cut off, and drove up the road for a mile or more before opening was found to the seashore. Husbands and wives were parted by the fire and smoke and did not meet again until the next day. Danielle took his wife, very sick, on his back to the edge of the lake, waded over some rods to a bog, which sunk with them. But he found old stuff and raised it so that his wife sat in the water until morning. So this goes on and on. The fire often steaming in his face when he was obliged to sink under, then rise and take a breath. I found him on Wednesday and took him home with me. He had eaten nothing for 26 hours. The fires in the early settler days were devastating all throughout the Maritimes. And this period of our history has just hasn't been discussed. But when you go looking for charcoal on our landscape, you will find it just about everywhere. And there's historical notes on like Barrington Passage area being on fire all the time. There are also cultural differences. When I lived in eastern New Brunswick, the Acadian culture is different from the British culture, is different from whatever other cultures. So some cultures made more fires, and it seems that there were more fires down here, and there's more fires in Kejimkujik. They used to light the macoke, or the bogs, on fire every 2 years for blueberry production. They had a cannery, they picked blueberries and huckleberries. And so we had a fiery past. Kejimkujik 100 years ago was described this way: this sinister land seared by 100 forest fires, gaunt skeletons of dead forests, yet blackened by Albert Bigelow Payne and the tent dwellers. And we forget that. It speaks to forest resilience, but we had a lot of fires. And it was mostly because we were doing slash and burn agriculture. We were setting the place on fire because we needed fields to grow potatoes to feed our families, and the only way you could get the fields going is to remove all the logging slash, to remove all the trees. So in the end, then we've got these, but a lot of those fires escaped from from the fields, and so then we ended up with these even-aged forests as the legacy that we received as generations down the road, and so you end up with these landscapes that are even-aged, and so they go, oh well, it's an even-aged stand, so we're just going to clear cut it because that's what nature has left us. So anyway, so you get these landscapes where it's basically 25 square kilometers of clear cuts. But basically, we're not allowing the forest to recover from that post-European settlement fire regime that we created. I just want to share this with you, that this is, again, 10 kilometers by 12 kilometers of pretty much nothing but clear cuts on top of the South Mountain, just above Bridgetown in West Dalhousie, and I'm from East Dalhousie. So, and poor Sue Skipton wrote into DNR when she looked at Harvest Plan's map viewer, and she complained about the clear cutting, and these are the kinds of answers you get back. Well, the forest management guides determine the appropriate harvest treatment that best emulates the natural disturbance regimes, and that's why I dwell on this so much, is because DNR has been using it as an excuse, a science-based excuse for justifying clear cutting, and it's just, all it's doing is perpetuating the lands that we'd set on fire earlier, our ancestors set on fire accidentally or purposefully to clear land. And, but the other reason they say that they're clear cutting is it depends on the ability of the forest to stand up to wind disturbance. All of these things have an influence on the harvest prescription. And so I advocate that, yeah, I think it gets pretty windy down here in Yarmouth too as well, but trees grow upright, am I right? I mean, there are windfalls, but mostly trees will still manage to grow upright on their own, and so they don't need help from the forest industry. It's just another justification for cutting. So DNR has stated last year that Nova Scotia forests are being harvested at a level far lower than they could be, and in 2016, I guess 2016, so 2 years ago, 3.6 million cubic meters of forest were cut down out of a possible 7 million cubic meters of province that was deemed available. And yet, when we look at what they're cutting, this is what they're cutting. These very young forests that are not even past the early successional stage. And so you know that they're clearly running out of wood, and this is only sustainable. This statement that's being made is only true if you base it on a 40 to 50 year cutting rotation. So another thing to bear in mind is these cutting rotations. So if this is your woodlot, starting off at ground zero, say you had a fire, and so the trees come in, they grow larger, but these are the trees that grow in the sunlight, right? These are our shade intolerant species, our early successional trees, and they're not built to last. Remember, we said they don't live for very long. At about 55 years or 60 years, they've increased some in wood volume. This is wood volume along the side. So they've achieved maximum wood volume, and then they start to die out. But the good news is that under the cover of the early successional trees are the later successional or shade tolerant species, the species that are better quality trees. So in comes your sugar maple and your red spruce and your hemlock and yellow birch, and so they increase in volume, and they're growing to be larger structure trees. They end up achieving greater wood volume levels on the landscape. And so if you were harvesting this, if this was your woodlot, ideally, if you want to get maximum wood volume out and maximum product value out, you want to harvest around 165, 175 years of age, of that stand age. And I added beech nuts here because beech is a shade tolerant tree species. It's a later successional tree species. It only starts to come into the mix right about here. And so if you want to have beech nuts, which is our most valuable wildlife species, tree species in Nova Scotia, you've got to wait till right about here for the tree to be mature enough at about 60 to 80 years of age to actually produce beech nuts. So if you care about beech nuts, feed everything: black bear, deer, porcupines, the birds, us. Yes, they're delicious. Is there still do you have the term, there's some Acadian people in the group, right? Do you still say on va à la fin? À la fin? No? Ça se dit plus? But because Douglas Sobey discovered that saying, and when I lived in eastern New Brunswick, they remembered, oh oui, on est allé à la fin chaque automne pour ramasser des noix de...
Oh, fen as in F-E-N.
But je sais pas si c'est fen comme, I don't know what, it's an old term, but they had as an expression for gathering beech nuts that's dropped from the language.
I wouldn't know where to find the beech tree in Yarmouth County, actually.
Wow. You would have had a lot of beech at one time. But beech is a very fire-sensitive species as well, like very thin bark. So if you're going to have frequent fires, you can't have beech growing. So just want to. So if so you can see why DNR wants to do these 55-year cutting rotations, though, because if you clear cut and then you wait, well, they say, oh, well, our trees are starting to die. Well, yes, they are starting to die around 55, 65 years of age, but they're supposed to, so that you move on to the next successional stage. And so it's just a tragedy that we've got these pulp and paper people advocating that this is the cutting rotation that they want to, because if you're just harvesting biomass, just fiber, if you're just looking for fiber, anything will do, then that's acceptable, but it's not acceptable. And so we need people like you to advocate for, we should be over here operating.
So what they're going to do is they're going to change the environment drastically, because these are going to be just softwoods, which means they're going to add a lot of acidity to the soil.
Well, they're not just, because remember there's poplar, white birch, other early successional species here. There's wire birch or gray birch. So it's not totally going to acidify your soil, but you're definitely not going, when you think of birds and seed eaters, you're not allowing to get over to these big nut producing trees over here and just larger structure. There are species that require large structure. So we are over harvesting and we're going on too short a harvest rotation, and we're not allowing the Acadian forest to redevelop, to get past this very early to mid-successional forest types. And in the process, we're liquidating the precious nutrients that are in the branch tops. So those, you mentioned that earlier, the branches and the tops, and because we're sending it all out for wood chips. Because I just beat myself to my own punchline, but maybe it's for a good cause. You know, jobs, the mills, etc. Well, no, not actually. These aren't saw logs. They're harvesting, and a lot of it's being sent to Sheet Harbor. I'm not sure where it's being sent to down this way, but it's being shipped to Turkey, to China, to whatever country will take our wood chips. So it's not going for, we're not getting a lot of benefit from the kinds of forestry practices we're seeing recently. So I feel like we're at a crossroads, the Liberal Party, but us as Nova Scotians, that if we go to the left, we go down Poverty Chips Road, and if we go to the right, we're going down a Healthy Forest Road. And it's important that we go right, and that change equals jobs. And change is hard, but we need to get back to a saw log economy. We need to focus on intermediate industries, small heating facilities like we have at Université Saint-Anne, that we have innovative markets, value-added markets, where we want an expanded community forest or more community forests. DNR, or lands and forestry as they're called now, really need to regain public trust through making these big changes. And also concentrating on carbon gains is really part of the silver bullet solution, I feel. But if we stay on this side, we're just going to get declining forest jobs, impoverished biodiversity. We're going to stick with those short harvest rotations based on the fake science. And we definitely don't want to move to a biofuel economy.
I've noticed so many, not the past couple of months, but before, so many truckloads moving east.
Yeah, well, Northern Pulp is down this, they're part of the West Fork Consortium, right? And so I see that I'm going past my time, so I want to, well, I don't want to put too many people. Larry, you can stop taking your photos. We don't need photos of me. So we should be demanding older forests too, based on what I was just showing on the graph. If you can remember that, demand for older forests, because we know that a lot of our wildlife species require these larger structure trees This used to be common on the landscape. How do I know that? Well, I did a whole research study on historical forest ecology, and the Acadian forest grew really big, old trees, all on its own, without silviculture, without, and we know that there's some species that require these mature forests and this kind of structure, and maybe some of you have already spotted the goshawk nest in the back. This was the goshawk that found me this spring. Typical, yeah.
Find you before you find them.
Yeah, they're very loud. But this open kind of stand for flying around and hunting in is of course good goshawk habitat. Well, you're not going to get that in that early successional forest. And we know all throughout Nova Scotia we've been losing goshawk nests because they've been finding them and then they leave a buffer, but it's only a 200-meter buffer around a goshawk nest. And I guess Jonathan Porter, the director of Lands and Forestry, was arguing that, well, does it really have to be 200 meters? You know, even like who's to say? And so. And in the historical forest ecology realm, I came across a lot of records for black birch, which signifies very old growth yellow birch. As soon as yellow birch gets older than about 200 years, it loses its yellow bark and becomes black. And so we used to log these out as high quality veneer. Well, I don't think we were making veneer back in the day, but those were shipped to England with our white pine and sawn into fine lumber. So Nova Scotia grew big, healthy trees without any help from silviculture, as I mentioned. Demanding legacy trees and areas within the ecologically based forestry triad thing, we should be demanding for legacy trees, trees that are just never cut. And we can make up for this somewhat on our woodlot. Here's a barred owl nest box that Larry put up near our place, which didn't quite work out. We got this guy instead. Kind of a palatial residence for a saw it, but that's who we got a number of years ago. But anyway, demanding legacy trees and trees that are large enough diameter and get hollow are important for wildlife and compensate somewhat for the lack of old growth that we have on the landscape right now. But we really need to get more old growth, more old growth. This is Bernard Forsyth, who came down to band our sawwhits, our little sawwhit family. Yeah, I like this one because he's actually looking at Bernard like you're not my mom. It's just, and they did all, I'm pretty sure successfully fledge. I was back and took a picture of this one just outside the nest box. So clear cutting in the end leaves no food and no shelter. We know the first thing that happens in a clear cut is the small mammal population dies off, and so if you're a barred owl or you're an owl or that relies on a small mammal population to stay alive, there's just no food there for you, let alone nowhere to live. Flying squirrels, another species. Here's an example of when you go on to Harvest Plan's map viewer and look around, because you see these outlined blocks. The green is Crown land. This is private land around near where I grew up. And these are proposed clear-cut blocks. And I go, really? We've got this little bit of Crown land stuck out into this maze of land that's already been cut because it's privately owned, and you're going to take this last bit? Are we that desperate for wood? And Dr. Bondrup Nielsen talks about the inhumanity of clear cutting and over harvesting is the wildlife displacement, this thinking that wildlife can just move somewhere else and live elsewhere. Just isn't true. It probably never was, because every niche tends to be occupied out there. But certainly in this scenario, where else are you going to go? There isn't a lot of forest left. These are all clear cuts all around there. And there are gray jays. I don't know if you have many down this way, but Yeah, it used to be common, yeah, I remember seeing them at my grandmother's bird feeder, but there are still gray jays up here. My mother has two coming she had 3 last winter coming regularly to the bird feeder. And so I just keep thinking of these deep forest dwellers, like the fisher. We're getting more fisher sightings in Kejimkujik right now, and I keep wondering if they're displaced or if there's maybe a rise in fisher population. But Lands and Forestry, or DNR, are clearly not managing for wildlife and biodiversity values. So people like you are very educated and well-informed, need to continue to advocate that there's more than just forestry that we need to think about on our crown land. We used to have a lot of mainland moose. We don't now. This was a moose somewhere in Queens County that actually found enough calcium to grow that rack. And we're not really managing for the last of our mainland moose. Species at risk are coming at increasing numbers. Here's chimney swifts, which we know prefer to nest in hollow tree cavities, or that's where they used to be, and then they moved to our chimneys, and now we line our chimneys, and so now where do they nest? They nest in my mother's barn, in the hayloft. We have a family that come every year and nest, and they were successful again this year with 4 young fledged. And so, but yeah, we can't keep building structures for them, and a lot of our subsistence farming, our barns are falling down now. So where are chimney swifts going to go in the future when we run out of these hollow trees? By the way, if you've never stood inside a yellow birch, or black birch in this case, it's a wonderful experience, even if it is kind of dilapidated. But I think of these cavity trees and this wildlife species that need these larger trees and larger cavities. And also, when we have vast areas of the landscape denuded, what does that do to these aerial insectivores and their diet? And I keep wondering if the chimney swift diet and tree swallows, and what are they eating when we cut down the forest and then the land dries up faster? And so insect populations, have you noticed down this way that maybe the black fly population isn't what it used to be?
That's worse.
Yeah, I know. I used to have to breathe a different way when I was a kid growing up in East Dalhousie, and now it seems like it might be bad for a couple of days, and then it doesn't seem so bad. It seems abbreviated, not like it was back in the day. In Bridgetown, we have a crisis right now. We have a new roost chimney for chimney swifts, and just a week and a half ago or so, I got a call that they were there with the backhoe, or whatever that machine is called, and they were the thinking was that they were ready to tear down the chimney because they kind of had it in a hangman's noose. They'd actually, I guess, dropped a camera down to see how healthy the chimney was and what state it was in, and they had every intention of tearing it down. It was part of a school that they had torn down, so they want to build a running track. And I keep saying, well, if people are just going to run around in circles, will they even notice if there's a chimney in the middle? Like, can't you just leave the chimney and have a running track too? So I've been on the phone, but just to be aware, there's very few of these large roost chimneys in Nova Scotia. And the thinking that they want to tear this down is, and it's still, the jury's not in on what's going to happen to this chimney. But birders are needed to help educate the masses, basically, is the story, is that we need you with your insights to call these politicians and explain again if you have to, and again,